Thank you very much, Veronika. Up next, we have our second roundtable discussion. Actually, is it our first? It's our first roundtable discussion for the day. Yes, yes, yes. And it is moderated by a man, I think, who is maybe the only person who we've had on a panel so far who can say that they were born in District 6. The topic on the table is repatriation and restitution, from conversation to action. So what does it take to move inter and cross-continental repatriation and restitution issues forward? What are African responses to European policies and vice versa? What's the case for reparations? What are good examples of successful restitutions? What are the challenges? What is the status of the situation now and the next steps for outstanding restitution requests? Is the repatriation of ancestral remains and cultural objects a vital act of cultural revitalization and reclamation of heritage? The moderator for this discussion is Professor Ciraj Rassool, who is from South Africa, Senior Professor of History at the University of the Western Cape. And he is joined by panelists from Madagascar. We have Rasoarifetra, Bako, President of ICOM, Madagascar. Veronika Châtelain, who we just met and listened to, from Senegal. We also have one of the curators of this convening, Monsieur Emmanuel Casarero, President of the Musée de Qui Branly, Jacques Chirac. We have Simbai Kojen Kwasira from Zimbabwe, Chief of the Makoni District, Zakhele Ndlovu from here in South Africa, Heritage Officer at the South African Heritage Resources Agency, and from Zimbabwe, Dr. Rudo Sithole, Founding Director of AfriMuhere, which stands for African Museums and Heritage Restitution. He's also a senior lecturer at the University of Zimbabwe. Please, can we welcome our panelists and starting with our moderator, Professor Ciraj Rassool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lebo. It is such a pleasure to be at the Homecoming Center in Caledon Street, where the home of my grandparents was. I was born up the road in the maternity hospital, and I was part of this museum, making this museum for 23 years as a member of its board. And we invested in this Homecoming Center as a space to do the cultural and memory work of restitution. The Homecoming Center is a home of restitution work. So it is very appropriate that we are meeting here for these discussions. And when we spoke of restitution from the 1990s and the early 2000s, we meant land restitution, another process of social restoration and healing, very difficult process that, as you know, has not been successful. It has had its problems. And the trouble that we have when we think of restitution is that we think of it as an event that will take place, of a grand occasion, perhaps involving an aeroplane, perhaps involving a welcoming ceremony at an airport, and maybe another welcoming ceremony in a garden of a parliamentary building. But as we have learned from our wonderful presentations earlier, from my sisters Diana and Molemo, that restitution work is not easy work. In fact, restitution is not an event. And I want to suggest to you that restitution is going to be with us for 1 or 2 generations. I want to suggest even further that restitution work is going to define the remaking of what we mean by museum. And that redefinition of museum has been happening in this space, in the Homecoming Center and in the District 6 Museum's exhibition space up the road, where this museum has inaugurated the concept of museum not as a building, not as a collection, not as a display, but as a series of social exchanges. So I want to make an argument for us thinking about restitution as restitutionary work. We need to think about it in programmatic ways. And I want to put another provocation on the table for us, following on from the arguments that we have heard today. That our European colleagues might use the concept of restitution when they speak in English. But as in the case of our German colleagues, they do not have a word for restitution in German. Their word, Rückgabe, in fact means giving back. The process of giving back is not what we mean by restitution. Restitution is a more long-term project. It is that project of healing. It is a project of restoration. In our case, it is an African project that has to be undertaken. Of course, restitution has legal aspects, and we've heard so much about the law, about, for example, France's doctrine of inalienability and the laws that have to be passed. Those are practical steps. They are legal, diplomatic dimensions. There are logistical dimensions, transportation, and so forth. But restitution is a social process. It has to be driven by African people. It, of course, involves government-to-government processes sometimes. Very important to think about that and those dynamics, because in Germany, when the work of Rückgabe began, they thought that individual German museums in these different provinces can go directly to communities to do their Rückgabe, to evade the nation, to evade the state. And so we have to look at what the balance can be of the involvement of national entities, but in recognizing that restitution can only happen at the local level. So I want to put to you the idea that restitution needs to be thought of as a movement in process, as a restitutionary movement, not as a series of events of return. So that we need to invest in civil society movements that advance the work of restitution. We need to guard and promote the work of Open Restitution Africa. We need to advance the work of AfriMuhere. We need to advance the work and build all of our capacities in different parts of the continent where we are extremely divided. We are extremely divided by the way we were colonized, by the European languages that we speak, even though we have Africanized those languages and we have adopted them as our own languages. So we say they're not imposed upon us. We took those languages when we made them our own. But the Savoir report spoke to West Africa. It spoke to former French colonies. We need to be able to advance restitution work to the entire continent. We need to do so in all of our different societies, through all of the challenges. And restitution will be fruitless if it is not accompanied by the epistemic work of decolonizing the museum, of rethinking what we mean by museum, of dismantling the categories of governmentality. Because the trouble with what our European colleagues do through Rukgaba is they do so within the systems of governmentality of European museums. And you will have noticed how what is called material culture and artworks have been divided from what they call human remains. And that the restitution of our ancestral remains and the restitution of our belongings happen separately, in separate silos, because of how European museums are governed. And often we realize that the dead were collected together with artworks and material culture by this very same collectors. So we need to think about all of these things together. And as we do so, we need to recognize that the making of museums and the entry of possessions and belongings into museums involved a process of objectification. They were turned into objects. They were not objects before. So we mustn't think of object ahistorically. We need to think of object and de-objectification. In this city, ICOM Museums of South Africa, one of the first museums to develop its own restitution policy, went through a project of what they called de-accessioning the unethically collected dead. And in South Africa, we have also spoken of the need to do the work of rehumanization. And we need to think about what that can mean in project work. That we are talking about de-objectification and rehumanization. We are saying that the dead are not to be spoken for by human biologists, because this is the work of mourning. This is the work of grief. And this is the work of healing. Wounds that are extremely deep. These are not just logistical matters. So with that background, to add to the presentations from this morning, I would like to call up my co-panelists. We are very pleased to have Bako Rasoarifetra. We have Veronika Châtelain once again. We have Emmanuel Kaserahu from Musée du Quai Branly. Zakele Ndlovu from the Restitution and Repatriation Office in the South African Heritage Resources Agency. We are also very pleased to have Simbai Kojan Kwasira. I told him I was going to South Africanize his name by calling him Kwasira, but he said he didn't mind that. And we have very, very pleased to have my long-time colleague, Dr. Rudo Sitole. Each one of them, I wonder whether we can start with Rasoarifetra, who Bako Rasoarifetra from Madagascar, where they have been through an experience of restitution. And I know she has a presentation which she is going to call upon. And I want to ask if she can address us for 10 minutes on our Malgache experience.
Merci et bonjour à tout le monde. Je salue particulièrement les membres de l'ICOM, surtout l'ICOM Afrique du Sud, et je salue aussi l'Alliance régionale Africa qui est présente ici avec son président. Je salue tout le monde et je suis un peu trop émue par tout ce qu'on a entendu tout à l'heure. Effectivement, parler de la restitution n'est pas facile, surtout que si on a vécu presque la même histoire. Alors, moi, je vais vous parler rapidement de l'expérience de Madagascar. Je me présente d'abord, donc Bako Rasoarifetra, je suis la présidente du comité malgache de l'ICOM. Je suis de formation historienne. J'ai fait mes premiers pas en tant que stagiaire au musée de l'Homme et aussi au musée du Quai Branly. Et je suis donc très attachée à tout ce qui touche donc, le patrimoine. Nous sommes membres de l'Alliance régionale Afrique et nous œuvrons beaucoup avec l'ICOM et l'ICOM en ce qui concerne donc tout ce qui est culture matérielle, patrimoine et muséologie. Notre expérience, donc cas de restitution, c'est très facile à présenter parce que au moment où donc l'État malgache avait créé un ministère de la culture à l'époque, le ministre avait pas demandé officiellement des restitutions, mais grâce à la collaboration avec les musées de l'époque, il y avait donc des collaborations fructueuses entre les musées. Alors, je dirais, par exemple, la restitution donc, du lit de la reine Rasoarifetra III. Je ne sais pas si vous connaissez un peu l'histoire de Madagascar, mais elle était en exil, donc elle est restée en Algérie, donc elle avait son lit avec elle, donc on l'a restitué rapidement. Ensuite, comme j'étais étudiante en France dans les années 82, nous avons parlé beaucoup d'attributs royaux qui ont été exportés pendant la colonisation. Et donc, c'est Georges-Henri Rivière, qui est le père de l'ICOM même, qui est venu à Madagascar restituer la côte de maille de Rasoarifetra I. Ensuite, avec les musées norvégiens, nous avons eu aussi donc, une restitution de musée en musée. Une autre forme de restitution, c'était la collaboration avec surtout les Français. À l'époque, il y avait beaucoup de trafic illicite et notamment des fouilles illicites dans la mer, c'est-à-dire donc ils faisaient de l'archéologie subaquatique. Donc il y avait beaucoup d'objets dans des canons du XVIe siècle qui étaient exportés et qui ont été interceptés par la douane française au Havre et qui, compte tenu donc des relations diplomatiques de l'époque, les militaires ont restitué ces canons. Donc c'était vraiment un processus très facile dû donc à la collaboration avec les douaniers français. Autre forme de restitution, après je dirais, le discours du président Macron qui avait dit donc qu'il faut restituer le patrimoine donc acquis pendant la période, une certaine période douloureuse pour les pays africains, surtout la colonisation. L'État malgache avait un projet donc de reconstruire le musée du Palais de la Reine. Je ne sais pas si vous connaissez un peu Madagascar, mais on a donc un site historique qui était l'emblème de notre indépendance, pendant la période, puisque nous avons été donc dirigés par une royauté. Et cette restitution, en fait, le président de la République voulait faire rentrer la couronne de la reine qui était dérobée en 2011 dans un de nos musées. Malheureusement, ce n'était pas la couronne, mais c'était la couronne qui ornait le dé royal de la reine Ranaval III. C'était la chaise avec laquelle elle se déplaçait. Donc la chaise, le dé, avait donc une sorte de couronne. Donc la couronne était rentrée officiellement. C'était un peu mal compris par la population parce qu'il manquait donc de la communication. En fait, la population ne savait pas c'était vraiment la couronne de la reine. Donc là, c'est aussi un cas d'une bonne restitution, c'est-à-dire une restitution avec succès. Actuellement, nous avons un dossier de restitution en cours qui est très important. Donc, la restitution de crânes de roi tués, et tout est en bonne, si vous voulez, un processus normal. Les crânes ont été localisés. Il y a une commission mixte qui est en train de se former pour étudier l'ensemble des conditions de rapatriement. Et la bonne nouvelle, en décembre, la loi a été votée en France pour la restitution donc, des restes humains. Rapidement, puisque je ne dispose que de 3 minutes, l'ICOM Madagascar va présenter un projet auprès du ministère de la Culture de la restitution de mobilier funéraire qui ont été donc exportés en France pendant la période coloniale. Alors, sur l'image, vous voyez très bien le nombre d'objets qui se trouvent malheureusement, mais heureusement aussi, qui se trouvent au musée du Quai Branly, bien préservés, puisque j'y ai fait mon stage. Ils sont bien préservés, bien mis en valeur. Et parmi ces objets, il y a des objets qui viennent d'une sépulture, d'une nécropole qui se trouve au nord-est de Madagascar. C'est la nécropole de Voemar, nécropole où il y avait 600 tombes qui ont été fouillées durant la période coloniale. Et les objets sont partis au musée de l'Homme, donc devenu musée de Quai Branly, et au musée du Nîmes, toujours en France, et une partie qui est dans notre musée, puisque je relève de l'université d'Antananarive. Alors, qu'est-ce que nous voulons? En fait, nous demandons, c'est un projet, je vous dis, pas encore officiellement, c'est que la restitution, le rapatriement, c'est en fait pour que la population malgache puisse se réapproprier de son histoire. C'est une histoire qui date du XIIIe siècle et qu'il ne reste plus donc que ces preuves matérielles pour pouvoir transmettre l'histoire, les Malgaches, d'où nous venons, comment nous avons vécu, quelle est notre place au niveau de l'océan Indien. Qu'est-ce que le commerce dans le sud-ouest de l'océan Indien a apporté pour la civilisation malgache? C'est ça la restitution que nous voulons pour que nous puissions donc enseigner à la génération future nous avons connu vraiment une période florissante et grâce à ce mobilier funéraire, nous espérons pouvoir créer un musée virtuel peut-être, ou d'autres musées, les conditions seront étudiées. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Madame. Thank you very much. The pressure is intensifying. 10 years ago, ICOM was a much more restrictive body for whom restitution was definitely not a subject. We are very pleased that those of us who are within ICOM can work in those structures for progressive causes and to do the work, because what we also are realizing is the extent to which museums that we associate so much with care have also been spaces and institutions of violence, that there are violent histories that we are dealing with. And we are very pleased to have with us today Chief Simbai Kojan Kwasira from Mukoni village at Musiwatunya in Zambia, where he comes from a community that experienced intense violence more than a century ago. And I want to ask him to tell us about that violence and the legacies that we work with in relation to restitution.
Thank you, the House, and happy Valentine's Day. Right, yes, this topic of restitution and repatriation and restoration is a very, very sad story indeed. To begin with, I think in Africa, we need restoration spiritually because our souls, our heart was taken from us because if you don't know your history, you are just like a cabbage within the society. And I think this is the starting point where everyone, we have to seek for spiritual restoration, restitution to begin with. During the time when the colonizers entered South Africa, this was just after the Boer-Saxon War here in South Africa. And when they put their Union Jack in Salisbury, then today Harare, the British were defeated by the Boers here in South Africa. Then they had to seek for a rerouting there because they could not have the guns they used to come through Cape Town and Port Durban. So they had to seek rerouting because here they were defeated and they were not allowed to use these ports. And because their ammunition was depleting, their food, their medicines, and also their the reinforcement of manpower had been cut. They thought of rerouting from Fort Salisbury, today Harare, to Beira. So during that period, the route that goes to Beira, it passes through Mutare. If I think a lot of you know where Mutare is on the eastern side. And then Mutare to Beira. During those excursions, they came to my area, which is Makoni. And that's where they met the first resistance. My uncle, my great-grandfather, who was Chief Makoni Mutota Chingaira during that time, then refused to be, to let them pass through. As I have said, you could see they had no medicines, no food, no guns, because of they've been cut here. How bitter they were. They were captured by my grandfather, and they were totally dismantled. So this is how angry they became. They had to seek for reinforcement and looking for other people within to assist them to fight my uncle. And this battle was done at a place which is called Gwindingwi in Makoni, whereby my grand uncle was murdered through firing squad of about 12 soldiers. A firing squad, his head was decapitated, and it was sent to Europe. Up to now, it is in the British museums. So that's how bitter that was. And my uncle, my uncle was the first king in Zimbabwe to be murdered. That was in 1896. These things happened from there, whereby a lot of people were subjected to these killings. And before the war ended, the first Chimurenga, we call it the first Chimurenga War in Zimbabwe. Before that war ended of land grab, we had about, we are still researching, we have about 25 to 29 kings whose heads were murdered and decapitated and taken to the United Kingdom. Some were spiritual leaders, like in Zimbabwe we have Mbuyane Handa, who was a spiritual medium, Kagui, who was also a spiritual medium. They were also decapitated during that war. Yes, this program of restitution in Zimbabwe initially was being handled by the Zimbabwean government. And it was going at a snail's pace, this restitution, restoration, and repatriation of our remains and artifacts. Myself, I became King Makoni, Chief Makoni. You see, our titles were also demoted from being a king to a chief. And this is what happened. When we saw that nothing was going as what we wanted, we formulated a committee that I am the chairman of repatriation of our forefathers' remains, human remains. We are mainly focusing on our forefathers who were taken their heads, remains were taken to UK. And this is basically how we came together, this committee of repatriation, we call it repatriation of remains of our forefathers. And I am the chairman, and we are working towards to have them come back. We are facing challenges. I think my time is almost over. We are facing challenges, mainly because there is identification problem within the UK, whereby we are failing, they are failing, or before this movement came, the remains had their names tagged on their heads. But the British, when they saw that the people were now trying to ask for their remains and so forth, they removed those tags from those skulls and so forth. So identification problem is one of the major sources which we have. Also, we have problems on resources. Our government, yes, we were talking about the South African government here, and someone was saying 8%, 8 out of 10. Someone said 3 out of 10. And I would say our government is still at 4 to 5 out of 10. It's not working enough towards the restoration of those heroes' trophies. So, in brief, it was a shame. And also spiritually, we were degraded to say we shun our religions at the expense of the external religions. That is what we are as Africans. Thank you.
Thank you. It is really extraordinary how similar the stories are that we have across Southern Africa and East Africa about who we are out of the violences of colonization, out of the dismemberment and defilement of the bodies of our ancestors. It is a common and consistent story when you watch the daily struggles that our Tanzanian colleagues are undertaking for the return of their ancestors killed at the time of the Maji Maji resistance. If we think of the way our colleagues in northern Namibia tell the story of the beheading of King Mandume Jan Demufayo and of how his head was buried under a German colonial monument. That we have all of these stories, it is widespread. We want our ancestors back. And when we want our ancestors back, we also think of the belongings of our societies also as our ancestors. This takes substantial organizing work. It is the work of blood, sweat, and tears. It is the work of organizing, of institutionalization. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Rudo Sitole with us from AfriMuhere, and a body that used to exist before, of which I was a proud member, the International Council of African Museums. And we used to meet every 3 or 4 years. Let me ask Rudo to address us.
Thank you very much, Professor Rassool. It is my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the French, all the sponsors of this great conference, which really is premised on building new ethical relationships between Africa and the Western world. I'm really excited about that because really this is implementation of the SAR-Savoy report. And I think with this kind of convening, we can move forward. Because we cannot move forward alone as Africans, and we cannot move forward with the West on its own. We need to collaborate, we need to work together. So heritage restitution is much more than the mere act of returning, restituting, repatriating the heritage objects to the countries and communities of origin. It is also about recognizing and acknowledging that the violent expeditions, like those which took place in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, there are many, many countries where this took place. They led to the disposition of Africans of their heritage. They were also dehumanizing, and they resulted in Africans losing their dignity and identity. That is a major issue that needs a redress. Africans are also convinced that holding countries, we don't want to say the countries that store, we will use the term holding countries, have unfairly profiteered from looted heritage, especially through museum entry fees. I've been to museums like the Louvre, I've been to American museums. You find queues and queues of people waiting to get into the museum, and they pay huge entry fees. And I hear in some museums, we are talking of millions going into the museum in a year, and huge revenues are generated, and Africans have not benefited from that. And some of the exhibits are solely based on African objects. They also go on tour where large and huge fees are charged. The looted objects also served a social, spiritual, and ideological purposes before having the now being touted aesthetic value. To us, they are more spiritual, they are more social. Therefore, heritage restitution should embody narratives of redress, repair, restoration, and justice. I underline justice, where gross injustices were perpetrated against Africans. So restitution or repatriation should be conducted under a reparative model, which comprises restitution or repatriation, compensation, measures of satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. I think somebody talked yesterday, Nairi, about how history keeps repeating itself in very ugly ways. As we witness right now in Gaza, we wouldn't want this kind of violations repeated on the African soil. So we need those guarantees. It's not just a matter of giving us, take your objects, take them back to your country, and we are done with you. We want to build new relational ethics. So restitution is crucial to correct colonial narratives as well, and stereotypes created by the West about Africa. Somebody said narratives are conduits for ideas which define the past, present, and future of generations. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower, to humanize, and stories have also been used to break dignity. They can also be used to repair that broken dignity. That is the work of museums, to tell stories. And we need to tell different types of stories. So we know what the speech by President Macron did. It revolutionized the way the world thinks, Then it was followed by the Sari-Savoy report, which jolted many holding countries to soften their stance on restitution. Africa had been demanding for more than 200 years, as Molemo said, but after that, after hearing their own, they softened. And the calls by Africans have since intensified. And we are, although they have intensified, we witnessed a period when things came into Africa very quickly, relatively quickly, but now, as somebody said yesterday, things have stalled. So one of the proponents of African heritage, Kwame Opuku, said 2 years ago that, at the rate of current restitutions, the 90,000 objects in France will probably take 3,000 years to be restituted to Africa. And now I think the figure has even gone up because the restitutions have literally stalled. So Africa needs to share restitution-based practice instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. We need to utilize continental platforms such as AFRIMIERE to build a restitution repatriation capacity and a strong movement. Because, I am embarrassed actually to say somebody who is not African like President Macron spoke strongly on our behalf. But as Africans, it's like we are shy. We are not convinced. We need to stand tall and demand what belongs to us. It is our right. It is a human right. Cultural rights are also human rights. So let's stand strong and have our heritage back. We need to include young people. The African demographic is characterized by a huge young population. But how many of them know about restitution? They are the exceptions, the Malemos and the Veronikas. We need to bring in the youth so that they are part of this strong movement.
C'est ça le travail de la communication, de l'éducation.
We also see that Southern Africa is lagging behind in terms of restitutions. West Africa is far ahead of us. Why? Because as soon as Macron spoke, they quickly came together, drafted a 5-year restitution plan, which they started to implement in 2019. The first plan expired last year. And we had a big conference in Dakar where ECOWAS was telling us what they've done. They now have a regional restitution committee. They have national committees to spearhead restitutions for the region. So we need to do the same about the SADC region. We are lagging behind. We have lots of human remains in Western museums. We have lots of objects in Western museums. So we need to follow suit and come up with our own plan. And as AFRIMIERE, we are prepared to work with the region to realize that dream. So our topic also said, what are good examples of restitution projects? They could be many, but in my opinion, it's those that are initiated and largely driven by the holding countries. We witnessed this month the return of Asante gold objects to Ghana from the Fowler Museum of the University of California in the US. The objects were looted by British soldiers, of course, 150 years ago. The museum said the restitution was permanent and voluntary. The museum staff actually traveled to Ghana to go and hand over the objects. So we see that restitution is fast and friendly when the holders acknowledge the problem and they take the initiative to return the objects. The other example of good restitution is the one which involved Naire with the Smithsonian. Again, it was driven from the holders. They said, this is a new era of ethical returns. The Smithsonian enacted a new policy and said, now we are following an ethical returns policy. It doesn't matter what happened. It doesn't matter what our other laws say. We are going to return. And they returned 29 Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. So what are the challenges? We can see them in current restitution issues. We have the issue of Ivory Coast, which has been trying to get the Gigi Ayokwe, the talking drum, from France. All preparations were made and they were happy. We were celebrating and saying, finally, the Gigi Ayokwe is coming to Africa. But boom, France came up with a new framework, which needs to go through parliament, which needs to be approved, and then after that, we will have the Gigi Ayokwe. Then we also have the case of the Nkonzo from Cameroon, which is currently in Germany. They did it. They did a huge online campaign. Germany said, yes, you can have the Nkonzo. But now it is told. There are lots of problems. And Sylvie Njobati says some of the problems include lack of proactivity and cooperation from holding institutions, unequal power relations. I think this one is a big, big issue, where the holding countries still want to play their master role, their colonizer role. There's also reluctance by holding countries to fund the return, and also demands for compensation by source countries or descendants in case of human remains. So we need a strong movement. We need to work together. We need to collaborate with the West and come to the table. Africa is drawn a common African position on restitution, which says Africa's heritage must be restituted unconditionally. So we have our own position paper also. So how do we come together and talk so that a lot more of Africa's heritage is brought back? We need to be partners, especially with the funding partners like Veronika and her Open Society and many other agencies. Let's come together and form a strong collaboration for the restitution of African heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rudo. In South Africa, we have just created an office on repatriation and restitution. And we have a new policy that many of us worked on for over a number of years to hammer out and arrive at a restitution policy. All of the restitutions that happened before of Sarah Bartman, of Klaas and Troy Pinaar, were done on an ad hoc basis without a policy. Now we have a policy and we have an office. And that office is located within the South African Heritage Resources Agency. One of the internationally significant aspects of the South African policy is that it covers, in the same framework, our ancestral dead of colonialism, our ancestral dead of apartheid, who lie in unmarked graves, often in the region of southern Africa, and there are increasing demands for the return of the dead fighters to their families. And we also made the argument that our dead in museums, our colonial dead that were assembled for the purposes of racial research, are also the dead of earlier conflicts. But in that same policy, we also have artworks and belongings also covered, in which we do not separate the dead from their possessions. They come to belong together sometimes when they are transported on the same ship. And we are very pleased to have my colleague Zakele Ndlovu, he doesn't mind if I call him Gacheni, who is here from the South African Heritage Resources Agency, to tell us about their work.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, and thank you to the fellow panelists that are sitting with me. It really is an honor to be sitting with all of you. And thank you to the French government and the French Institute and Alliance Française for organizing this event. So the South African Heritage Resources Agency is the parent, basically, of the RRO. We refer to as RRO, Repatriation and Restitution Office. And I know Prof. Rassool likes it the other way around, which is restitution and repatriation. Basically, it's a product of the newly cabinet-approved policy that deals with the repatriation of human remains and heritage objects. That is what it's called, the National Policy on the Repatriation of Human Remains and Heritage Objects. I will get to the vocabulary of it a bit later. But as Prof. Rassool has well summarized it, we are implementing the policy, and the main focus currently is the return of the liberation struggle heroes and heroines that had died and passed on in various African countries and also other global north countries. And currently, we have a sixth phased implementing plan that works around that. And the reason why there's much focus on the liberation and struggle heroes and heroines is because their families have been requesting since 1996, as the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, the recommendations was the return of these heroes and heroines. And we have seen over the years that society and communities and families have been slowly losing hope in the repatriation and the restitution of their loved ones, of their family members. So that's why we have emphasized on focusing on that. But parallel to that, we are also, as we are a very young office, we were only established last year. We started operating last year. So we are currently laying the groundwork in terms of our implementation plans, our IPA, institutional partnership agreements, where we work with all the museums around the country. Also, our strategic plan as an office on how we're going to handle these repatriations. And we are currently also working on a workshop with the Ministerial Advisory Committee to workshop an implementation plan for heritage objects, because that hasn't been a focus. And what we have been doing is, ever since the office opened shop, we have been receiving a lot of claims also from private or families or even organizations for heritage objects, and as well as for ancestral mortal remains to be repatriated back. And we're trying to run the processes parallel to each other so that we can draw from these experiences and be able to inform our decisions going forward and how we plan on these restitutions in the future. And we have received many claims, such as from the Smithsonian of Khoisan remains that are there, the Hunterian Museum in Scotland, and recently Youngest Stearman an individual who was used for scientific research by Harvard University, and his remains are there, and we have to facilitate these returns amongst many others, many others. And the challenges that we sort of identified during these processes and the areas of improvement are at a political level as well as at the economical level. Politically, every time we engage in such setups, discussions, and discretion, these are my views. Every time we engage in these setups, what I often hear from the global north, Europe and Western countries, regarding the repatriation requests, what I often hear is they're going to review their legislature, they're going to review their policies and their bills and so forth. And to me, it sounds like they're saying, we'll think about it and we'll tell you how we're going to do this. Whereas what we want to hear is, take us by the hand, tell us what to do, and show us how to do it. And we have been having that sort of tug war between the two. And communication is very vital when it comes to these repatriations, because at the end of the day, the most important crux of the matter, the people, the society, and the healing that needs to be brought back to society, and as well as repercussions, of course, and restitution. And as Prof. Rassool was saying earlier on, that restitution is not just bringing back, repatriating. Those are separate. Repatriating is ticking boxes and making sure that the items are shipped well and you get all the necessary permits and so forth. And restitution work is something that can go on for many generations. And it's also, restitution work is not just erecting a monument or a memorial and hiring 2-3 individuals from the community to work there. It's about setting up development structures that will last as long, if not longer, than the period of which these crimes took place, because these are crimes that took place. And we cannot have restitution that lasts 5 to 10 years. It's not feasible, not for us Africans. We need to see restitution go from one generation to the next. I think I'll just sum it up. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Thank you, Châtelain. As you can see, this is a very important office. They are very busy, and they are going to get busier when the movement starts putting pressure on them, because that's what they need, because they respond to pressure. And we've always made arguments for committees and agencies and museums to be proactive rather than to wait for claims. But sometimes that demand to be proactive means that we prioritize the giving rather than the demanding. And I'm very pleased that Emmanuel Casareru is with us today from Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, one of the new formerly called ethnological museums that emerged 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, and we watched it unfold. We watched the struggles taking place in the making of the Museum of the Two Jacques, as it was then called, and also you will remember the speech of the ambassador last night, not the one he made here, but the one that he made there, where he used a certain French term translated into English, which was a little bit odd for English speakers to hear. He used the term primal art, the concept of primal, which of course in French used to be primitive, but now première, the premiere art, but which still kind of suggests a hierarchy of art making, right? It's still a colonial category. And one of the primary museums that faces the demands for restitution is the Musée du Quai Branly. Now, I know that Emmanuel's shoulders are broad, that he can't speak for Europe, maybe speak for France, we don't know, but Emmanuel is also our brother from the soil of the Pacific. And we are very pleased that he comes from one of our co-colonized societies, right? Societies that generated also a certain kind of museology because of the nature of its colonialism. And we've had the opportunity once or twice before to dance together and talk about these matters. So from your vantage point, your background, your scholarship, your museum work, and placed in the position where you sit, when you hear these presentations and the notions of movement and demand and what restitution means, how are you moved by these discussions?
Talk in French.
Oui, absolument.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis effectivement très heureux de faire partie de cette discussion qui me permet aussi, et merci à l'ambassade de France et à l'Institut français, de permettre aussi au musée français de continuer cette discussion sur les restitutions dans une partie de l'Afrique où la France n'a pas beaucoup eu de relations dans le passé et où peut se nouer des relations nouvelles. En tout cas, je suis très heureux de constater que restitution, le mot restitution n'est plus un gros mot. C'est un mot qui porte en lui désormais une dynamique. Il a été dit ce matin dans cette keynote speech par Molemo que c'est un processus. Et c'est vrai que toutes les expériences que j'ai jusqu'à présent, que ce soit dans ma fonction précédente qui était d'être directeur d'un musée effectivement dans le Pacifique Sud et ce qui est ma position aujourd'hui d'être directeur d'un musée en Europe, c'est cette dynamique qui permet de changer et de regarder différemment une histoire commune, souvent complexe, de prendre en compte aussi des voix qui autrefois n'étaient pas prises en compte dans un musée, et d'essayer de construire ensemble un avenir au moins muséal meilleur, parce que je suis très persuadé que les musées sont des zones de contact. On les perçoit souvent comme des endroits statiques où les objets sont immobiles et morts. Il n'y a rien de plus faux. Les musées ne se ressemblent jamais à eux-mêmes, ils changent. Moi-même, je suis à la tête d'un musée qui ne ressemble plus exactement à ce qu'il était à son ouverture, parce que les générations changent, parce que la demande sociale change, et les musées sont des endroits extrêmement capteurs de ces demandes et de la manière dont il faut y répondre. J'allais dire, ce qui est permanent dans un musée, finalement, ce sont les collections. Et c'est elles qui permettent, de génération en génération, de tenir un discours différent à chaque fois. Le même objet est porteur de multiples significations. Et selon les périodes, on voit bien que certaines parties de la collection sont mises en lumière, à d'autres périodes, ce sont d'autres parties de la collection, et ainsi de suite. Et le discours tenu sur une catégorie d'objets a changé profondément depuis la création de ces collections. Donc les musées sont des endroits dynamiques et la restitution est un nouveau processus pour créer une plus-value culturelle. non seulement pour écouter l'histoire difficile et essayer par ces actes communs de participer, non pas simplement d'être dans, ça a été dit de multiples fois, celui qui renvoie la balle, et puis après, finalement, peut s'en laver les mains, mais au contraire, accompagner et travailler ensemble pour créer une nouvelle forme d'éthique, une nouvelle forme de relation. Je crois que c'est vraiment le fondement du discours prononcé en 2017 par le président de la République française, Emmanuel Macron, à Ouagadougou, c'était de créer une dynamique qui prenne en compte à la fois l'histoire, dans toute sa difficulté, dans toute sa multiplicité, dans toutes ses polysémies aussi, parce que l'histoire nous peut être vue de multiples façons, selon la position que l'on adopte. Mais en tout cas, une manière de créer un lien nouveau et d'encourager à co-construire une histoire nouvelle avec ces objets, qu'ils soient en Europe, qu'ils soient ici, qu'ils soient aussi des objets virtuels, des objets intellectuels, parce que le patrimoine, on l'a dit, ça n'est pas seulement des objets, c'est aussi la capacité à les produire, c'est aussi la capacité à exprimer ce qu'ils veulent dire. Donc, je crois que nous sommes dans une période extrêmement dynamique et je suis très heureux, avec le musée du Quai Branly, d'être à la fois l'endroit vers lequel tous les yeux se tournent quand il s'agit de restitution. Et j'ai bien entendu, Madame, votre question sur les fouilles de Madagascar, et on va étudier ça ensemble. Mais aussi un endroit où on peut justement co-construire. Et la manière dont nous sommes saisis de cette question de la restitution, c'est d'abord d'inviter nos collègues à venir voir de quoi l'on parle. Parce que ces collections sont très multiples. On croit souvent que les collections, c'est un ensemble homogène. Il n'y a rien de plus hétérogène dans sa construction, dans sa matérialité, que des collections de musées. Parce que c'est une stratification lente de processus multiples qui viennent se déposer pour constituer ce qu'on appelle les collections. Et au fond, c'est cette intelligence, cette forme de géologie qu'il faut essayer de comprendre ensemble pour faire en sorte d'apporter le plus de voix possible. Et je voudrais revenir sur le terme art premier que vous avez utilisé, qui n'a jamais été le nom du musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, qui s'appelle officiellement d'ailleurs le musée des arts et des civilisations d'Afrique, d'Océanie, d'Amérique et d'Asie, puisque nous avons la chance d'avoir des objets des 4 continents sur une période historique extrêmement importante, puisque ces collections ont commencé en France au début du XVIe siècle, au moment des premiers voyages français sur la planète, et que l'on a depuis lors toute une histoire finalement de cette relation que la France a nouée avec différents endroits du monde. Et la période coloniale est une période très importante sur laquelle il nous faut travailler. Donc je pense que c'est un travail que l'on doit faire ensemble et en transparence. On doit regarder ensemble et accorder nos points de vue aussi, parce que la manière dont nous utilisons les mots, la manière dont nous sentons les choses peut être différente d'un continent à un autre, mais aussi d'un pays à un autre, et aussi à l'intérieur d'un pays, d'une culture à une autre. Et ce qui m'intéresse beaucoup dans ce processus, c'est que l'on voit bien qu'il n'y a pas une réponse unique. Il y a des réponses adaptées à chaque histoire, qu'elle soit en Afrique, en Amérique ou en Océanie, et que c'est ce travail fin de liaison et de relations humaines qui nous permet de construire quelque chose ensemble. Donc l'idée, c'est vraiment de faire ce travail, parce qu'il y a un certain nombre d'objets qui peuvent être restitués, et il y en a d'autres sur lesquels on ne peut rien dire. On ne sait pas. L'information a disparu. On sait que les objets ne sont pas nécessairement des objets de collection par destination première. Ce sont souvent des objets d'échange. Et les relations humaines commencent par de l'échange, continuent par du commerce, éventuellement ont des périodes avec des violences, mais il y a toute une partie de la relation humaine qui s'établit au travers d'objets. Il est très intéressant de voir que dans beaucoup de cultures, que ce soit en Afrique, en Océanie ou en Asie, que beaucoup d'objets européens sont intégrés très tôt dans les cultures matérielles. Et en fait, on voit que ces objets sont des sortes de médiateurs qui ajustent à la fois le local et le translocal. Et je pense que c'est là-dessus qu'il faut qu'on réfléchisse aussi comment ces objets peuvent voyager, comment ils peuvent aller au-delà des musées qui les retiennent. Et on a effectivement fait tout un travail et un projet, plusieurs projets, dont l'un en particulier, qui touche l'Afrique et qui est un travail commun avec une dizaine de pays qui ont été traversés par une mission scientifique qui est célèbre en France, qui s'appelle la mission Dakar-Djibouti, qui entre 1931 et 1933 a traversé le continent et nous a donné tout un ensemble d'informations. Et le travail que nous faisons avec les collègues des musées africains sur cette histoire, c'est aussi de faire émerger ce qui est au-delà de l'objet, ce qui est le savoir. Il y a un énorme savoir qui a été acquis. Les gens n'ont pas simplement, dans ce cas précis, prélevé des objets, ils ont enregistré, ils ont noté, ils se sont intéressés aux langues. Donc il y a tout un ensemble, un corps d'informations qui aujourd'hui peuvent être restitués aussi, ou en tout cas partagés avec les pays avec lesquels nous travaillons. Donc voilà, juste un petit exemple pour montrer comment nous essayons de progresser.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. We have about 10 to 15 minutes over now. We've had a number of presentations. What I would like to do is to collect 3 or 4 short questions to be directed at anybody on the panel or at more than one person. And we will remember your questions and we will deal with them globally rather than in a Q&A fashion. Okay, we have 2 on the right, first at the back and then Carolyn. The microphone is coming your way.
Thank you so much. My name is Espera Donvosi. I work for ICOM and I'm chair of a program called Youth Heritage Africa. And then I would like to thank the panelists for addressing these particular issues of restitution in Africa. I'm from Benin and I've been part of the Benin restitution process and then I follow so many steps in this thing. One question I want to address to Mr. Emmanuel from Kimberley. And when you were speaking, you say there are some objects that is not easy for you to identify where they are from. And then I want to ask you, what did you do to find out? Because in many countries, in many cultures, we have those people who we know it. People know if I say something from Benin or from any country, I can say this particular. So there are those people who have an implicit knowledge, like a tacit knowledge about their culture, so they can be able to help you. Are you developing collaboration with some other expert or local community or people who hold traditional knowledge to help you identify those objects in the provenance? And one aspect, like when we are all speaking, we talk about restitution, and then I think now we are going to a clear theme, like it's a process. We cannot put too much emotion into restitution. We can leave the emotion to communities, but experts like you, like us talking about restitution, should be able to stay away from emotion and think long-term process and think how we do make this sustainable. So I want to ask the panelists, mostly our colleagues from Madagascar, for instance, what is the cultural policy? What is the policy put in place in Madagascar to address restitution on a long-term basis, and also to avoid that we go back to, again, people taking or stealing our artifact and sell it back. So which policy do you put in place? So it's about policies and provenance. Thank you.
Right? So we take Carolyn Hamilton next.
Thanks very much. I'm very nervous about fast and friendly return of things. The extraction of objects and their export to Europe. Well, first of all, that prioritized objects. And the important thing is that severed the connection of the objects to their own intellectual and philosophical and spiritual contexts and thinking. And it replaced them, it took their place away from local thought and put it in the place of anthropological thought. Now, Ciraj, you made that point where you said, it's just not the same as return. It's not the same as return what we're talking about. It's the rebuilding of the connections to the thinking and the discourses out of which they were extracted. But that thinking and those discourses themselves are not necessarily readily accessible to us at this point in time. We have good sense of what they were, but they present a colossal challenge for a recovery, a historical recovery. That's a big challenge. And the colossal challenge is because of the extent to which they were consigned and pigeonholed, I think, by European epistemology. So the recovery and the repair, I think, is an incredibly slow work of epistemological and creative work. Now, the creative work, I think, is moving well. The historical work is pretty slowed up, and it's going to be slow. People have been talking about generations of work, and I think it's right. That's what it's going to take. Who's going to fund that? It's not clear to me who's going to fund that.
Thank you. For those who are not aware, Carolyn Hamilton and her colleagues have done very important work for us on the whole concept of untribing the archive. Very important for us as we think about tribe, stam, as a colonial construction. Complicated histories of how tribes were made. We have a third question in row 4, and the microphone is coming your way.
Donc, merci, monsieur le modérateur, pour votre leadership dans la gestion de la parole et des communications. Je m'appelle Jean-Paul Koudougou. Je suis conservateur de musée et actuellement président de l'Alliance régionale ICOM pour l'Afrique. Donc, je vais intervenir sur 2 points. Voilà. Le premier point, c'est un petit commentaire très rapide pour dire que de mon point de vue, et je crois que ma conviction se renforce sur le fait que pour ce problème, cette question concernant les restitutions, vous l'avez dit, ce n'est pas un problème, une question qui est nouvelle. Voilà, depuis les années pratiquement 60-70, ça a été abordé. Et on est quand même, de nos jours, un peu étonné aussi par l'enthousiasme qui entoure cette question. Enthousiasme mêlé aussi de passion, de rancœur, il faut le dire, de frustration. Voilà, aussi de personnes ou bien d'entités qui veulent assumer des responsabilités, mais aussi de beaucoup d'espoir. Espoir parce qu'en réalité, au-delà de toutes les questions qu'on évoque, avec tout ce qu'il y a comme contour autour de cette question, il y a des paradigmes nouveaux, voilà, qui émergent, notamment ces notions de co-construction, mais aussi de dynamisme dans les relations entre les différents professionnels. Et je pense qu'un des points positifs au niveau de cette question de restitution, c'est le fait que de plus en plus, il y a un dialogue, il y a beaucoup plus de respect entre les professionnels du Nord et du Sud. Et on essaie de trouver des solutions communes par rapport à une situation qui, de mon point de vue, est regrettée par beaucoup de gens, que ce soit de façon sincère ou pas. Mais je pense quand même, pour le bénéfice du doute, que tout le monde est sincère. Peut-être que c'est de la naïveté. Et voilà pourquoi je me satisfais aussi de cette formulation de la conversation à l'action. Parce qu'on a l'impression qu'on fait beaucoup d'érédites pour beaucoup de panels où on s'est retrouvé depuis qu'on aborde ces questions de restitution. On va sur des choses qui ressemblent plus à des vœux pieux, de mon point de vue. Et c'est pour ça que je vais poser une ou deux questions pour voir concrètement qu'est-ce qui est fait à Mme Sitolé. Voilà. Au niveau de la structure qu'elle dirige, je crois que beaucoup d'actions tournent autour de cette question de restitution. J'aimerais savoir comment l'analyse a été faite pour dire qu'il y a eu de la timidité, parce que c'est effectif. On a vu un enthousiasme depuis 2017, après l'engagement pris par le président Macron à Ouagadougou. Et puis, on a l'impression que les choses sont en train de... la poussière est en train de tomber. Qu'est-ce qui explique cette timidité-là? Parce que je crois que vous avez fait un petit sondage à ce niveau. Voilà. Donc, le deuxième point, c'est vous avez parlé aussi du fait qu'on ne sent pas une vraie implication des jeunes autour de la question. Ils ne s'approprient pas ça. Donc, j'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce que votre structure fait pour inciter, pour impliquer les jeunes à cette question-là, pour qu'on sente que vraiment la relève va être assurée quand les discussions vont se poursuivre. Parce qu'il faut être réaliste, du jour au lendemain, tout ne va pas se résoudre. Mais comment ce passage du témoin-là va être fait entre, j'allais dire, les doyens, voilà, et puis cette jeunesse qui vraiment doit prendre la relève pour poursuivre la question. Merci.
Okay, in the 5 minutes or so that we have left, we're going to start with Dr. Sitole, and then I'm going to ask Veronika if she wants to add. You know, I don't want to burden her because she gave us a beautiful keynote, but I think she does want to add one or two things. The main questions, of course, are directed at our two colleagues here, but let me start with
Thank
Rudolph.
you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kudugu, for those questions which are really critical. And you are asking what is being done at the moment. We, as AFRIMIHERE, we have webinar series. We are establishing partnerships with the West. Already we have established partnerships with Australia for capacity building in repatriations. Later this year we'll have a workshop on that. We have established the hubs in Western museums to collaborate with the diaspora and with the holding countries. Because as I said, we cannot do this alone. We need to collaborate. And on top of that, the main issue, we need funding partners. That's why I referenced the Open Society. It has really been a huge player in Africa trying to capacitate the restitution movement. So in terms of the youth, like you said, we cannot do everything, but even as national players, are we bringing in our youths? As a continental organization, we can tap into what is happening in the nations. Are you bringing in your youth to your museums, to heritage issues? Are you telling them about restitutions? Here in Benin, for example, when they received those objects, there was a rallying behind. The youth were now starting to come to the museums. So we need such events. As AFRIMIHERE this year, we'll have webinars as well, where we are focusing on the youth and bringing them into this work. About the timidity, maybe it's my personal opinion. I feel like as Africans, we are really not going all out to request our heritage. What are our governments doing? What are our ministries of culture doing? If you remember in 2022 when we did that survey, we discovered that a lot of West African countries had established restitution committees. Mm-hmm. But I tried to follow up even to today. Maybe you can tell us about Burkina Faso. You know they've not been activated, those committees. So that's where I feel as Africans, we are really not going all out to get our heritage back. Thank you.
Veronika?
We have 30 seconds. I'm happy to let them go for it.
Emmanuel?
Oui, je vais répondre à la question qui a été posée. Effectivement, nous avons besoin de faire des recherches. Alors je sais que souvent, et je l'ai entendu aussi ce matin, la question des recherches de provenance irrite, parce qu'on a l'impression que c'est quelque chose qu'on met entre la restitution, la demande de restitution et la restitution pour éviter de le faire. C'est au contraire la recherche historique nécessaire pour ne pas faire d'erreur, pour rendre les bons objets, pour ne pas commettre d'impair, rendre aux bonnes personnes, aux bons groupes culturels. Donc c'est vraiment une temporalité qui est longue et nécessaire. C'est la temporalité de l'historien, ça n'est plus la temporalité de la politique ou du désir immédiat. Et donc c'est un travail de long terme. Les objets ne sont pas tous accompagnés d'informations. Il est plus facile de travailler, comme nous l'avons fait pour la République du Bénin, sur des objets qui ont été saisis par des militaires dans le cadre d'opérations militaires, parce que la ressource en archives est riche, voire contradictoire parfois, mais en tout cas, elle nous permet d'entourer avec une certitude profonde les 26 objets qui ont été rendus à la République du Bénin en 2021. Pour ce qui est du reste, nous travaillons évidemment avec les groupes, les directeurs de musées, mais aussi les groupes culturels. On le fait en particulier. Alors, notre travail de provenance ne s'arrête pas à l'Afrique. On travaille aussi sur les collections américaines, qui sont beaucoup plus nombreuses d'ailleurs dans mon musée que les collections africaines ou les collections asiatiques, etc. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est justement cet échange que l'on peut avoir, parce que cette information, elle n'est pas forcément figée dans le temps non plus. On peut avoir une information à un temps donné sur un objet tel qu'il a été recueilli, mais l'histoire locale peut avoir retenu des significations nouvelles ou au contraire des significations plus anciennes. Et ça enrichit considérablement la vision que nous avons de cet objet ou de cette série d'objets. Donc nous le faisons évidemment en invitant, et là grâce à des bourses du ministère de la Culture, les collègues des différents musées pour venir travailler avec nous et nous permettre aussi de faire un pas de côté et de considérer l'objet de manière différente, avec un affect, avec une sensibilité qui n'est pas forcément celle qu'on aurait, qu'on a professionnellement au départ.
Sakele, Simbai, any final comments from
I'm just going to come in with regarding the sort of research when it comes to the origins of the geographic location of objects. And what we try to do is work with our national museums and rely on their, part of the restorative work is the verification of these objects through scientific research, community engagements, and so forth, and also working with the museums, institutions, and relying on their knowledge and resources, advice and guidance in collaboration with the fundis, with academics, and as well as families, and to inform this. And once that is done, then we try to locate relocate the object back to as close as possible to the point of departure where it was removed and extracted. So perhaps an institution around there, if it's going to an institution, or then families, or then we hand them back to the families, because these objects are things that are were being used on a daily basis, that were being touched, that were being passed on. So they are not supposed to be kept in a glass perspex box. They're supposed to be interacted with.
Yeah, I think what I've learned is that in Zimbabwe we need to have a policy of restitution. We don't have a policy at the moment. And I think with Dr. Rudo, we are going to lobby for that, so that we have a policy that will guide the nation on restitution and restoration. Thank you.
Thank you. Finalement?
Oui, alors finalement, c'est moi qui ai le dernier mot, ou c'est vous après. Mais en réponse à la question de tout à l'heure, j'adhère totalement à notre collègue zimbabwe. Honnêtement, je le dis, nous n'avons pas encore de politique en ce qui concerne le retour des biens culturels, aussi bien des restes humains que des objets. Mais comme je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure, c'était cas par cas, des cas isolés. Maintenant, avec cette demande de retour des crânes du roi tué Rasakalav, ça demande vraiment une grande réflexion. Qu'est-ce que nous voulons, nous les Malgaches? Et déjà, il y a 5 ans, l'ICOM Madagascar avait demandé au ministère de la Culture créant une plateforme de réflexion en ce qui concerne ce retour de biens culturels, parce que c'est très important pour nous, c'est rétablir la mémoire, sacraliser ce qui a été désacralisé surtout, et en fait donner à nos générations futures des possibilités de connaître l'histoire. C'est ça qui est important. Donc les objectifs doivent être suivis d'une politique culturelle. Et là, nous en sommes en discussion avec le ministère de la Culture actuel. Voilà.
Colleagues, this is difficult work. It is painful work. Let's keep talking. Let's keep building. Apologies that we went 5 minutes over or so, but please join me in giving everyone a round of applause.